Hello and welcome back to History of Philosophy. And this week we're going to take a look at the Enlightenment and the return of reason. Now you might ask yourself, when did it leave? When did reason disappear? Well, if you remember from last week, we were in the ancient Greek world. We were kind of just moving to the cusp of its end. And suddenly here we are in the 1600s. So the return of reason is a return of reason and rationality in opposition to the fundamental stranglehold that the Christian church had over Western Europe and had over thought, in particular philosophy. So we have philosophers such as Thomas Aquinas, Augustine, St. Altham, and others who are creating philosophical ideas on behalf of the church. And anyone that moved away from church teachings paid a severe penalty. And we'll see when we talk about Galileo, who is typically not considered a philosopher, but I think is part of that larger pushback by science and by philosophical reason to reestablish the possibility of dissent or disagreement, or, God forbid, pun intended, skepticism, which is what we see in Descartes. So this is what we're going to take a look at for this week, is the move back to scientific reason, scientific rationality, as an alternative to church teachings, which had been around for, by this point, closing on 1500 years. Okay, so we're going to move here to our first slide by providing a little bit of background here. So we move 1500 years to the very early 1600s, so the late 17th century. So remember again, in the same way as we were moving backwards through the Greek times, we're moving forward, but the 17th century is actually the 1600s. And Paris is kind of the intellectual capital of Western Europe. And from a almost sort of Eurocentric point of view, it considered itself the intellectual capital of the world as well. And we'll talk about that. So no matter how you look at it, Paris is also a place in a kind of turmoil, because there are competing ideas that are struggling to assert themselves and to dominate one way of thinking over against another. Now, what had been happening throughout the 13th century and by way of response in the 17th was Aristotelian thinking, or what became scholastic philosophy. And Aristotle really kind of makes a return to the table, we'll say, when his writings are rediscovered, because they had been translated from Greek into Arabic and into Latin. And from there, once they were translated into Latin, they were used by more and more Christian thinkers and theologians, medieval philosophers. So Aristotle doesn't necessarily lose the war. He may lose the battle eventually, but in this particular case, what's happening is Aristotelian thought is really kind of the main focus in the Middle Ages and just moving to the cusp of modernism. And modernism, again, depending where you're looking, may start as early as the 1500s. Some individuals believe that the modernity and modernism starts even with the Renaissance, which would be the 1400s. So we're not going to worry too much about trying to pin it down, but what we are going to try to do is figure out what that setting was that allowed people like Descartes and Francis Bacon and others to sort of become more and more important. What were they doing by opposition to Aristotelian or scholastic thinking? That's kind of what we want to do. Now, needless to say, Aristotelian thinking was still very powerful, but there was still the beginnings, right? The rumblings of a possible revolution in thinking in France, Italy, and in England. And what was happening is we were getting these new individuals thinking along scientific lines, metaphysical lines that were less concerned with theological thinking as they were with simply trying to understand the world. So we have on the one hand empiricists like Galileo, Francis Bacon, Thomas Hobbes. We have rationalists and metaphysicians like René Descartes, who are part of this groundswell, right, that is trying to reestablish some sort of firmament in the history of philosophy. Now, having said that, it's not to mean that the church gave up easily. They did fight back. And in certain parts of the world, in Western Europe and in France in particular, it became very dangerous for individuals to proclaim certain views about the world. Many were burnt at the stake. Many were tortured and killed. So heretical thought was a real thing at this particular time. And the church still had a lot of power. But depending on where you're looking, England, there was less power after the Civil War in the 1600s. Germany, with Luther, we end up having a Protestantism, right? A protest against religion and religious thought of a certain kind. But France was still kind of backwards a little bit in terms of this progression towards allowing religion and religious institutions to be simply part of the social fabric rather than being the only social fabric. So the scholastics did fight hard to maintain this power. These scholastic thinkers were certainly supported by the church, and they, for example, were able to get a lot of Galileo's work condemned and prohibited from discussion. And this was around the sort of moving up towards the middle of the 1600s. And even Descartes' work, which is quite surprising because the first thing that Descartes tries to do is prove the existence of God. But Galileo and Descartes' works were on the index of prohibited books in the 1600s. And if your book ended up there, you couldn't talk about it, you couldn't discuss it, you couldn't present these ideas to any kind of scholastic audience. It was literally dangerous to do this. But at the same time, the writing on the wall was that things were beginning to change. As science was getting a foothold in the history of philosophy, and reason and rationality became sort of new ways to look at the world, what was happening was this notion of God being within the world and some religious entity controlling events. There's this new idea that starts to bubble up, which is this mechanistic view of the world. And this would be a mechanistic view of cause and effect, right? Suddenly this notion of causal relationships becomes more and more important. The fact that an action is the result of a particular cause or causes. And so the world now is being reevaluated using this mechanistic model rather than one that looks at the world as somehow the substantiation of some religious entity. And this is sort of a theist being or theistic being that we can communicate with and we can try to appease and pray to. The beginnings of this pushback from science is presented, first of all, in a new view of the world, this mechanistic view of the world, and the idea of the movement of atoms. Now, the movement of atoms is not brand new. Epicurus had talked about it. Democritus had talked about it, the pre-Socratic Epicurus writing after Aristotle. Lucretius was a Roman philosopher who was enamored with Epicurus, wrote a fantastic poem, an epic poem called On the Universe. And there we already see the notion of atoms in motion. But what happened was, over that 1500-year period, with the church having a very strong hold of the discourse of ideas, right? The marketplace of ideas. These kinds of notions, atoms, a mechanistic view of the world, basically fall by the wayside. And we are unable to talk about it. But with this new reintroduction of this worldview, we have not only new ideas, but we have new mathematical tools, we have new scientific methods, inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning, and all of these critical tools allow us to understand the world in a better way. We're not relying so much on a godhead or some spiritual entity kind of gluing everything all together. No, scientists want to sort of take things apart, see how they work, and put them back together again. And of course, old problems, right? The old way to resolve a problem no longer worked because we have science, we have the beginnings of new social and political institutions. And really, you can compare this to the shift from mythological thinking in ancient Greece to a more sort of rational and perhaps, again, in quotations, science-based view of the world. Because what was happening was with the beginnings of early forms of democracy, old mythological stories were no longer able to deal with these kinds of ideas. They had no examples. They had no stories and parables by which we could think through a dilemma. The dilemmas that were being presented were brand new. And essentially what was happening was individuals were no longer able to use old tools for new problems. And this is really, if you were to try to present the history of philosophy to someone, the old elevator pitch, you could tell them it's that. Individuals more and more find that they're unable to solve old or new problems using old tools, and they need to come up with new tools. And in this case, a mechanistic view of the world, atoms in motion, new scientific methods and formulas, inductive and deductive reasoning, are there by necessity almost in order to make sense of the world that was going on, and certainly the world that was being discussed at this particular time. So some of the new ideas that were being discussed and considered, and again, this should sound quite familiar. Like the world of the pre-Socratics is kind of not unlike what was going on here, because again, that 1500-year period where the only philosophizing was on behalf of the church, and of course, all that's happening here is work being done to prove something that has considered to be always already there. Now we're looking forward. We're looking for the first time towards the future and a better understanding of, for example, the structure of the universe, concepts of time and space, the location of the soul, the notion of immortality, God's role in creation, God's relationship to its creation. I'm going to be always careful to not say his, because I don't want to fall into the trap that the pre-Socratics warned us that an entity is always something that we are familiar with. Let's give it a pronoun of its, right? This spiritual entity, maybe a god, but let's call it it, right? So the ultimate role that it has in creation and the universe, whether human beings have knowledge, innate knowledge. Now this should sound familiar. This is Plato's idea that the knowledge that we intuit, which is within us, is that something that really existed? Because we'll find out in a couple of weeks when we talk about John Locke, he comes up with a radical idea in which he says, no, we are blank slates when we are born. So the Platonic notion of intuited knowledge that is always already there is not something that Locke buys into. He doesn't agree with that. He doesn't believe that is the case. And of course, because of that, it gives us an opportunity to realize why each one of us are so completely different in our worldviews and our backgrounds, our experience, all the things that shape us, that help to shape who we are. Those kinds of thoughts, they start with Locke. They start around this particular time. But some of the background, again, the structure of the universe, concept of time and space, the location of the soul, God's ultimate role in creation, and whether or not human beings actually had knowledge in the first place. So the first person we want to look at is René Descartes, who was considered to be a rationalist. And this is different from an empiricist. We're going to look at an empiricist very shortly. But let's take a look at Descartes. Now, he was a French philosopher, mathematician, a scientist. He's considered the father of modern Western philosophy because of this radical break that he makes from Aristotelian thinking to this sort of Western, modern Western metaphysical thinking. And it is very unique. So Descartes is considered to be the father of this new kind of thinking, right? Modern Western philosophy, skeptical doubt and so on, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, all these things we want to take a look at. Now, Meditations on First Philosophy, published in 1641, it's really kind of the text that anyone studying Descartes should begin with. In fact, if that's all you read, really that's all you would need, because Descartes didn't write a lot, but he wrote incredibly clearly. And unlike some of the philosophy that's written these days, even with just a minor amount of French knowledge, you could probably read his work in French. He took great pains to write clearly and simply and directly. So his ideas are very, very approachable. And yet at the same time, he's making this fundamental, or what's called an epistemological break with that previous way of thinking. So that's why he's considered the father of modern Western philosophy. So his best known philosophical statement, if you wish to reduce all of that life's work into one quick little soundbite, it would be cogito ergo sum, which is I think, therefore I am. So let's take a look at that, say what exactly that means. Okay, in Discourse on Method, what Descartes is trying to do is he's trying to set up a set of principles that he could know without any doubt whatsoever. And this is really where Descartes shifts gears from previous modes of thinking, because what he was employing, what he was using, was radical skepticism, radical doubt. And this is what makes Descartes also a deductive thinker. Now, when we think of deductive, sounds like detective, and essentially that's what Descartes is doing. He takes an idea and whittles it down to one single thought. And that single thought is that he's thinking. And if he's thinking, he exists. So that's what cogito ergo sum means. But the notion or the method by which Descartes is able to achieve this is called radical skepticism. So here's what's happening, right? So we have previous versions of skepticism. It emphasizes critical scrutiny, and it also exercises caution, intellectual rigor. Now, these are all things that Plato had done and Aristotle had done as well, but it's radical. Descartes is ready to strip away everything, and if he ends up with nothing, that's okay, because it shows that the method is working. So, since the ancient Athenians, skepticism has been in the past used to emphasize critical scrutiny, a way of gathering knowledge through systematic doubt or systemic doubt and continual testing. And then finally, any kind of claims about the limits of human knowledge, because we also need to make sure that we are not suffering from hubris and pride and thinking that we can learn about everything if we just have enough time. And Descartes says, no, there are limits. So let's see just what those limits are. So Descartes rejected all ideas about reality that could be doubted. Now, that sounds like a certain person we've talked about. That would be Aristotle, right? To reject all ideas about reality that could be doubted. With Plato, he looked at reality as constantly crumbling away, right? It's not steady, it's not consistent, it's forever coming to being and ebbing away. So we need to look beyond that. We need to look at ideas, because ideas are eternal. Ideas are ahistorical, timeless, pure, right? All these ways of looking at the world are those that belong to Plato. If you're looking at the world metaphysically, you're thinking about ideas of the world and about the world, not the world itself, right? So Descartes says, look, I want to reject all ideas about reality. And for Aristotle, reality would come through the senses. He was an empiricist. And so empiricists, when they look at empirical information, they're looking at information that is coming through the five senses. Now, that's not to say they stop there, because once you are given some kind of sense data, your brain's got to kick in, right? Your brain's got to start processing this information. Do I recognize this sensation, this thought, or this feeling? Can I categorize it somewhere? Does it remind me of something I had done before or experienced before? So when we talk about empirical thinking, it isn't just the senses. It is the senses and then harnessed up to the mind and especially to memory. But Descartes was ready to do away with all of that completely. Reject all ideas about reality that could be doubted even a little bit. So he writes in part 4 of Discourse on Method, but now I wanted to devote myself solely to the search for truth. I thought I needed to do the exact opposite, to reject as if it were absolutely false everything regarding which I could imagine the least doubt, so as to see whether this left me with anything either indubitable to believe. So anything that could be doubted gets tossed out, the baby with the bathwater, and away we go. So anything that could be doubted, maybe it's something else, gone. And as Descartes is whittling away this large idea of what can I know, right? What can I hope to know? He's whittling this away. And of course, as he's doing this, he has less and less to work with. But that's not a bad thing, because Descartes arrives at the single fundamental principle that thought exists. No matter what, even if you are doubting, you're still thinking. So thought could not be separated from myself and from my being. Therefore, I must exist. This is what Descartes is thinking. If I am thinking, even if I am radically doubting something, I still continue to exist because it is I doing the thinking. The thinker and the thought must be one. And so what I did is I tried to write this down in kind of the Cartesian subject, we'll say. And if you think of it this way, there's kind of four parts. All thought requires a thinker. All thoughts require a subject, right? Something to think about. All thoughts require a thinker who is a subject, and all thoughts require a subject who is its thinker. So there is a relationship between the thinker and the thought being one, because thought cannot exist independently of everything. There has to be a source. There has to be someone doing the thinking. So that is Descartes' radical break. He strips away everything until finally the last thing that's left is thought itself. And it isn't thought that is floating in the ether, right, by itself. No, it is something that I have come up with. I am the one doing the doubting. I am the one who is alive thinking. I think, therefore I am. Therefore I exist. So if Descartes could doubt any kind of given empirical fact, the senses could be wrong, he believed and he concluded that something, right, his own mind or someone, his own self, could be doing the doubting. So the fact that doubt could still be present in empirical data. Now, there's also in rational information and rational ideas, you could doubt that as well. But ultimately, the very, very most basic thing that you cannot remove is the act of thinking. The act of the thinking that results in a thought. That cannot be removed. So he continues in part 4, that I looked carefully into what I was. I saw that while I could pretend that I had no body and that there was no world and no place for me to be in, I still couldn't pretend that I didn't exist. So I could not doubt my own existence because I am the one busy doing the thinking. And so, again, this sounds both very common sense, but at that time, highly radical. So what did that make Descartes? Well, it made him an absolute skeptic, right? He was ready to refuse any kind of authority of all previous philosophers. And again, this should be important because that's where that epistemological break is, right? That fundamental shift. So refusing to accept the authority of all previous philosophers. Well, Plato said it, and Thomas Aquinas said it, and Aristotle said it. No, Descartes says, that's all fine and good, but I can doubt that. I can doubt that that is even correct. And even the truth of his own senses, his own sense data, he was willing to doubt and render skeptical. He could doubt everything, though, except his ability to think. So these, and they're not considered attacks, but the refusal to accept a figure of authority is what makes Descartes' ideas so radical. Not only is it radical doubt and radical skepticism, but it is a refusal to accept the authority of previous philosophers. I will find out about it myself. And so this kind of thinking, and especially scholastic thinking that was fueled by Aristotelianism, 16th century Stoicism, the theology of St. Augustine going back to the 300s, Thomas Aquinas and St. Alcim, all of these individuals had used Aristotle to prove the existence of God. They weren't using it to disprove the existence of God. That's what made Descartes so radical. Now, let's qualify that by remembering that the first thing that Descartes does, as soon as he is able to present the fact that he can doubt everything except his own ability to think, the first thing he does is tries to prove the existence of God. There you go. Now, Descartes was no fool. He knew that in France, for anyone to go against a church meant almost certain death in the 1600s. So all of his writings, Discourse on Method and First Philosophy, he's doing this from the comfort of Belgium, not from France. He wasn't a fool. He knew that the church would look at this notion of radical doubt and probably not read the rest of it, because this is quite early. Because what Descartes does in Discourse on Method is he shows how the method works, showing radical doubt, and you show the word doubt to the church, and guess what? They won't want to read any further. And yet the second half of the book, Descartes is trying to show us the possibility of the existence of God, scientific proof. So this is very important to remember, because when we look at Descartes, we think about radical skepticism, but Descartes also tries to prove the existence of God in an absolute way. So he was not someone that was anti-theology, very much the opposite. He may have been a mathematician and a scientist, but he was also a believer. But he also wanted to save his skin. So all of this work he's doing while essentially hiding out in Belgium, right, to be very careful. So he works through his ideas, breaks with the authority of previous figures, and begins working on what he calls his natural philosophy. And the first thing he does, he rejects the categories of matter and form. He talks about a distinct body and a distinct mind, the body with that of the mind. And yet what's really odd is he says they are indivisible, but they operate independently. It's a bit of a paradox, which we're going to look at in just a moment. Okay, really what Descartes gives us at this point is what's called continental rationalism. Rationalism of the most extreme and rigorous kind. Continental because it comes from Western Europe. And this branch of philosophy is really the beginning of human reason as the foundation, all right, of the natural sciences. Reason becomes the chief source and the measure of knowledge. Is this knowledge reasonable? Can I reproduce it? Is it something that I can prove to others in my writings, in my discussions, that it actually exists? Or am I asking you to make a leap of faith and say, well, you just have to trust me on it, that God does or does not exist, or whatever it is you're talking about. But here, reason and rationality are the chief sources and the measure of knowledge. If something is rational and reasonable, it's likely true. And truth, this is something that Aristotle had tried to do, and Plato himself was trying to do as well, metaphysically, is that truth could be discovered not through the senses, but only by intellectual deduction. Now, we talked a few weeks ago with Plato using sort of truth by consensus. His dialogues were constructed so that each individual that is in the story or the parable can agree and disagree and dissent in one way or another with sort of the main speaker. But eventually, Plato constructs this dialogue and this conversation in such a way that there is at least some modicum of truth that is achieved through the discussion. Descartes, on the other hand, believes that this can be done by a single person simply through intellectual deduction. Deduce, strip away, and then finally find that one single entity that is absolutely true. That is what rationalism tries to do. So, as you've noticed, I've been comparing Cartesian and rationalism with empiricism. And so the main difference between the two is rationalism believes that ideas don't need to have a grounding in reality. We can discuss thoughts and ideas without having examples. We can simply talk about them on a metaphysical plane, right, beyond the physical realm. And that is contrasted with empiricism. And empirical thinking is thinking that is based and developed from the senses. And this is something that Descartes essentially gets rid of. And he believes that if we can think deductively rather than using our senses, we're more likely to have absolute knowledge. And this is exactly what Descartes is trying to do, right? He's trying to create a sense of exactitude, because here, well, if we can find something that is absolutely true and correct and real, there's no arguing. Now, why is that important? Well, because at the time Descartes and Bacon and Galileo and others are writing, there are incessant and relentless religious wars happening across Western Europe. Now, what does that have to do with philosophy? Nothing directly, but indirectly, it is constant arguing over facts in quotations. So if you can come up with a scientific method, right, a rational philosophical method that will achieve absolute truth, it becomes much more difficult to argue over it. Then it just becomes a power struggle. But Descartes, in the back of his mind, was very likely thinking about that. If we can achieve some sort of absolute truth in the world, the likelihood of people arguing over it because it is absolute is less likely. And if we can buy into the notion that reality has a logical structure that may or may not need a godhead behind it, if we can look at that logical structure in nature and we can look at it and grasp it through the intellect and using deductive reasoning rather than the senses, we're more likely to come up with absolute knowledge, right? Knowledge that is long lasting. And so Descartes' Meditations and First Philosophy tries to do exactly that, right? It tries to create this intellectual revolution, and it replaces Aristotelian philosophy. This would be sort of the formal cause, teleology and so on. All of these views of the world that really are grounded in reality. There is a concerted effort by Descartes to move away from the real world, we'll say, and into the realm of pure thought. And so empirical Aristotelian science is replaced with this new, almost metaphysical science. Now, that's not to say that Plato and Aristotle didn't use reason and rationality. They did. But the difference between them and Descartes is that Descartes was using reason and rationality and harnessed to radical doubt. That's what makes him the founder of modern Western metaphysics. So, still thinking about the same thing, causal effects, identity, time, space, the soul, and all these things. And he does write about these things, but he writes them in a way that he tries to strip away everything that can be doubted about those subjects to achieve, or at least arrive at, some kind of absolute truth. So, how did he go about doing it? Well, he went about it this way, right? He thought that the Aristotelian method was prone to doubt because it was based primarily on the senses. And again, I wish to stress that no one is a pure materialist. No one is a pure empiricist. We'll see with Francis Bacon, and who was one of the very first to come up with this scientific method, that there's no such thing as a pure empiricist. It is always a combination of the senses followed by rigorous testing. So let's keep that in mind. So Descartes' method, he tried to do away with the Aristotelian method that was originally empirical, or he began empirically. He thought it was prone to doubt because our senses could be, could raise some degree of doubt, something we hear or see or experience. And because of that, he wanted to replace that final causal model of scientific explanation with a mechanistic model, a cause and effect model that could be measured. We could see almost like as if the world was a kind of mobile. And if you moved one part of the mobile at one end, you knew it would move something at the other end because it's all connected together. So causal relationships, cause and effect, correlationships, mechanistic models that things sort of tie together where one thing moves and moves something else. That is now the worldview. There's a shift away from the notion of natural laws towards a more scientific explanation of the world. And so this is really where Descartes asserts himself. All right, he tries to address all these issues, his method of radical doubt. It clears the way for this search for truth that really is harking back to Plato. It should, right? It should in the back of your minds. So, okay, well, that's kind of what Plato was doing, right? He wanted to achieve this absolute eternal notion of truth with a capital T. And so in his work, Descartes sort of essentially resets Western philosophy. And he does it in a way that says, okay, we can use radical doubt to get to these points where we know absolutely for sure that this is correct. So if we can do away with the unreliability of the senses, which is typically what empiricists do, we can begin to rebuild, in this case, not build brand new, but rebuild this system of previous doubts. And we can rebuild them using absolute certainty. Now, Descartes had lots of ideas, but really the one that he's most famous for is simply radical doubt that leads to cogito ergo sum, right? I think, therefore I am. So he didn't do a whole lot of work about politics. He didn't talk about society, talked about religion in the sense of trying to prove the existence of God. But he was more concerned with establishing a particular method, right? Discourse on method. Short book, maybe 50, 60 pages long, which is remarkably short for a philosophy book. But it is about how that method works. There's not a whole lot of content, but we see this formal investigation into what this method actually is. So we're trying to find absolute certainty. We know the existence of reality external to the mind, this dualistic notion of the mind from the body, the mechanistic models of physics. All these things are the kind of the bread and butter, right? The content of the method. And of course, the idea of a mechanistic model of physics based on geometry, that should sound familiar as well, because one, Descartes was a mathematician, and two, Plato tried to do exactly the same thing. So once again, Descartes is trying to replace that old Aristotelian method of causal factors, of the causal and formal aspects of something that comes into being. He wants to do away with all of that because for Aristotle, the beginnings of knowledge start empirically. And he states that very clearly. Descartes is trying to move further back, right? Back closer to Plato's metaphysical view of the world. But he's doing it using radical doubt in order to achieve absolute certainty. Absolute certainty as a foundation. Okay, so what Descartes does is he creates this kind of dualism, right? There's a duality between the mind and the body. And it becomes a problem because the mind-body issue is very difficult to figure out in Descartes because I think, therefore I am sounds like mind and body are one. And yet he keeps arguing everywhere else that the mind and the body are utterly distinct and irreducible. One cannot be reduced to the other. And when he says, for example, that the mind can operate without the body, that doesn't mean that it's just a brain inside a jar somewhere on a table. No, what he means is the mind can come up with its own ideas independently of the body. So Descartes argued that the mind was a substance of its own. It could be understood without any other substance, including bodies. And a God could create a mental substance all by itself without any other created substance. So there's kind of an idea where we're almost godlike in our abilities to sit and reflect and think about things and conjure things up to come into being that are independent, utterly independent of the body. The body is simply a vessel that carries around the mind. And the mind is king. The mind takes over everything. So as much as there is a dualistic view of the world, with Descartes in this Cartesian system, is that mind and body are utterly distinct. And so what is remarkable is how I think, therefore I am, is presenting to us sort of an interrelationship in Descartes' ideas of these two entities, these two substances, when in fact he says no, they are in fact utterly distinct. So if you were to sort of list what we've talked about here, we're talking about rationalism and empiricism. So let's take a look on the right-hand side here. Rationalism is what we've been talking about, knowledge based on reason and logic, the fact that we can conjure up our own thoughts independent of sense data. Mathematics is a paradigm of knowledge, the notion that mathematics is pure, geometry is pure. We can talk about geometric shapes without ever having to conjure up an example. genuine knowledge is certain. And certainly genuine knowledge is possible. The relationship to experience is one that is very brief, because there is, in rationalism, an attempt to not think so much about sense data and the importance of sense data to the foundations of knowledge, but the fact that if we are looking at knowledge based on the use of reason and a mathematical rigor, and genuine knowledge is certain, then we're less likely to worry about experience, because we're trying to find those absolute truths. And so because of that, the relationship to experience is kind of problematic, right? Experience does not produce certainty and does not conform to reason. And also that experience is at its best second-class knowledge. Now, an empiricist wouldn't disagree with that. They'd say, yes, absolutely. It is second-class knowledge. It is the beginnings of our ladder or bridge, or whatever you want to call it, towards knowledge. But compare rationalism to empiricism, where knowledge is based on experience and experimentation. And therein lies that the bringing together of empirical and rational thinking. Experience is the empirical part. Experimentation is the rational part. So again, no one is a pure empiricist. You could be a pure rationalist, and you could come up with all kinds of crazy ideas that have no bearing on reality, and that can be dangerous. But an empiricist, or an empirical thinker, at least starts in their quest for knowledge in experience, but immediately thereafter will begin to experiment to test whether this experience is valid, that it can be doubted. So we're still being somewhat Cartesian about it. Secondly, experimental science is the paradigm of knowledge. So constant experimenting, I come up with a hypothesis, I have to prove that hypothesis, and if I can't, likely this isn't very solid material. And then if that's the case, I have to reformulate a new idea and continue to experiment. And experience and experiment rarely, if ever, produce certainty. And anyone that screams, as they have been over the last couple of years during the pandemic, about scientific data concerning COVID-19, at no point did anyone ever say, this is the science forever. First of all, it took about 6 months to figure out what this thing was, and it was constantly being updated. But those that don't believe in science would look and point to the constant updating as science not being worthwhile. No, that's what science does. Science is always doubting. Can I reproduce this? Is this hypothesis correct? Can I reformulate a hypothesis? Maybe I've got new data. How will this new data affect my old ideas? So the notion that science is written in stone is absolutely wrong. It never has been, and it never will. But the combination of experience and experiment, right, can at least produce some degree of certainty until something better comes along. And finally, some empiricists believe that mathematics can be certain, but we have found that mathematics can sometimes be wrong. It does, but perhaps not all the time, or maybe not to the same degree that maybe science is. Okay, so that is Descartes, deductive reasoning, rationalism. Now we're going to take a look at Francis Bacon, who is an empiricist. So this is someone that would be following in Aristotle's footsteps. Descartes would have been following in Plato's footsteps. So Francis Bacon, a philosopher, a statesman, a scientist, a jurist, a speaker, very, very influential character in the world of science and also in the world of philosophy, because he was a practitioner of what he called the scientific method. Now that's compared to, let's say, radical doubt. We'd say, okay, radical doubt, that belongs to Descartes. The scientific method, that's Francis Bacon. And so Bacon said, look, this could be achieved, right? This is the scientific method could be achieved using a skeptical and methodical approach whereby scientists could minimize doubt. So he's not dispensing with Descartes. He's not saying he's wrong. But what Bacon is doing is combining these two ideas, these two ways of thinking, saying, look, the scientific method should take from both fields and take the best